Hey, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So glad to be here with all of you tonight. We should have a great chat. Thanks for tuning in. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell, and let's go. Let's do it.
American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
Welcome, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad that you're here tonight. We're going to have a great conversation about a number of things. So the way we generally do things, for those of you who may not be familiar, is I give some opening remarks. My opening remarks are then followed by the roll call, where we find out who's on the other side of the camera. I call you all out as I see you, names and locations. And then after that, I answer super chat questions for the rest of the night. So if there's something you would like me to talk about in the second half of our show, by all means, shoot me a super chat and I will write it down and it will be on the list for the second half of our show. Let's remember, it is you, the audience, who make the second half of the show what it is. You guys, with your super chats, you get me talking. So ask me a question that will get me talking. Ask me something that will get me fired up. So glad to have all of you here with us tonight. Make sure you are subscribed. Make sure that you have hit the notifications bell so you get notified. You get notified next time we do another one of these streams. Shoot me a super chat if there's something you want me to talk about in the second half of our show. That is always appreciated, and it makes the second half of the show more interesting. There you go. Quick couple announcements. I went on Kim Iverson's show earlier today. It just aired. I'll be cutting that footage for YouTube very soon. So be sure to check that out. I talked with Kim Iverson for about a half hour about my new book, Where is America Going? And it was quite a challenging interview because this book, this is some intense stuff in this book. It's not kindergarten communism by any means. This is some high level analysis, some of the concepts that we have developed on these streams for a while about Bonapartism and divisions in the ruling class and etc. But I think it went really well. So keep your eye out for that. If you haven't gotten a copy of this book yet, I recommend you do because this book is making a lot of waves, to say the least. It was a great chat I had with Kim Iverson earlier tonight. Video for that will be coming here on this channel very soon. If you'd like to get involved in what we're doing here, we need more members in the Center for Political Innovation to carry out our operations. We just had an amazing conference in Washington, D.C. to counter Joe Biden's Summit for Democracy. We had the Summit Against Hypocrisy. It was a great success. We're continuing to sum up the success. So please join the Center for Political Innovation. We need more members in our organization to carry out the great work that we're doing. We're part of the continued efforts of the Rage Against the War Machine Coalition. There's a great kind of network of libertarians and LaRoucheists and others, Jimmy Dore leftists and others that are doing interventions around the country. The CPI is definitely part of that. Our members are continuing the great work of the Rage Against the War Machine rally, and we're also preparing to possibly print some more books and have some more conferences. And we are hitting the ground running, and we could use you. So if you'd like to be part of that, by all means, sign up. So those are our announcements. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. I think we should just kind of jump into it. Just kind of jump into tonight's opening remarks. But first, I will write down the first super chat. Dum, dum, dum. Writing this first super chat down. All right. Very good question. Wrote it down. Folks, I want to take you back to the 1800s. I'll take you back to the 1840s, 1830s, 1850s. Because there's an event in the history of this country that is really important to understand. You want to understand why the United States is the way it is. If you also want to understand the process through which change comes about, you want to understand how revolutions happen, you want to understand the objective laws of history, you need to understand these events from a scientific perspective. And it is hard to do. Hard to do that if you're the kind of person who's attracted to Marxism. I'll tell you, when I talk about the Civil War, when I talk about the rise of Abraham Lincoln, when I was first interested in communism, I had no interest in that because I had sat through many of those boring documentaries by Ken Burns. Oh my goodness. Ken Burns' documentaries were the most boring thing I had seen. I don't know if you remember Ken Burns, but he made these PBS documentaries about the Civil War, where there'd be like quiet music playing in the background and he would slowly pan over the pictures. It was like watching grass grow, these documentaries he made about the US Civil War. It was so goddamn boring. It was so boring. And it would just be, actors reading letters that people wrote, and there would be a narrator who would explain the Battle of Antietam happened in this place. And there'd be this calm music and the slow panning over. Oh my goodness, those were horrendous. Horrendous. And he's describing an event. What was the death count of the US Civil War? US Civil War. What was the death count? It was like 500,000 people. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, because there were Americans on both sides. It is. Oh wow! It was 616,000 people, right, killed in the U.S. Civil War. 616,000 people died. A dramatic moment in our history. A dramatic moment in our history. And the way it's discussed is so boring. And then they made a movie a few years ago. I don't know if you saw this movie. It was awful. It was an awful movie called Lincoln. And Steven Spielberg directed it. And the guy who wrote Angels in America wrote it. And the film was openly intended to be an apology for Barack Obama. The guy who wrote it is the guy who wrote Angels in America. What's his name? He's like a liberal playwright. He wrote this play about the AIDS crisis called Angels in America. What is his name? Tony Kushner. So Tony Kushner wrote the screenplay. Steven Spielberg directed it. And the movie was really boring. And I remember sitting in the movie theater and thinking, how is it they made a movie, took an event where hundreds of thousands of people died, and they made it into a boring movie about men giving speeches? Because that's what it was. And I thought, how is this possible? But that was kind of the point of the film, right? And it was an awful movie. It was an attempt to apologize for Barack Obama and his miserable presidency by explaining how hard it was for Lincoln to pass the Emancipation Proclamation. And the film, was just not historically accurate. That Lincoln passing the Emancipation Proclamation took place in the context of a an all-out social revolution. You know, but they were trying to explain that, oh, Barack Obama, it's so hard for him. Tony Kushner openly said in his interviews, it was so hard for Barack Obama to pass the Obamacare, Affordable Care Act. And we're trying to make a movie to get people that are radical leftists to understand how hard it is. They made a film that was trying to apologize for Barack Obama, and it was awful. The only good part of the Lincoln movie that I thought was when they had the guy who played Thaddeus Stevens, right? They had Thaddeus Stevens give his like angry rebuke to a pro-slavery congressman. That was kind of amusing to watch Thaddeus Stevens takedown of the pro-slavery congressman. But other than that, the movie was boring as hell. And it's like, how do you make a movie that's boring as hell out of one of the most dramatic, explosive events in American history? You know, I believe somebody observed, I forget who it was. They said that the reason that Americans are so ignorant about the U.S. Civil War is because that's the one moment where the American bourgeoisie was playing a revolutionary and progressive role. And the American bourgeoisie is very embarrassed of that. The billionaires, the bankers, the people who run the United States are very embarrassed about the fact that for a couple of years, they were on the vanguard of a social revolution, and that they played an exciting revolutionary role, liberating oppressed people, empowering people like Harriet Tubman. You know, Harriet Tubman became the first woman to lead, you know, soldiers into battle in the United States. And, you know, empowering Harriet Tubman, empowering, you know, Marxists, and empowering the labor movement, and that the U.S. ruling class is genuinely embarrassed about the fact that because they had to, because they were in a crisis, they were forced, the American bourgeoisie was forced to play a most revolutionary role. And so the U.S. ruling class, in order to cover up that at one point they did play a revolutionary role, have done everything they can to bury and pile dog shit on their own revolution. And people have compared it to the French Revolution, right? I mean, the French Revolution, the French bourgeoisie played a very explosive and revolutionary role, and they've been apologizing for it ever since. And that seems to be the situation in the United States, that they have worked really, really hard to make you not interested in the Civil War, to make you feel like the U.S. Civil War is boring as hell, is not interesting at all. And until recently, they were blatantly rewriting the history of the Civil War from the losing side's perspective. They did all of that to just obscure what really, really happened. The Civil War was the second American Revolution. I'm going to read to you what Vladimir Lenin said about the American Civil War. This is what he said. This is what he wrote about the U.S. Civil War. This is what he wrote. He wrote, "The history of modern civilized America opened with one of those great, really liberating, really revolutionary wars, of which so few can be compared to the vast number of wars of conquest, which, like the present imperialist war, were caused by squabbles among kings, landowners, and capitalists. That war was the war the American people waged against the British robbers," he's talking about the American Revolution, "who oppressed America and held her in colonial slavery. And the same way, these civilized bloodsuckers are still oppressing and holding in colonial slavery hundreds of millions of people in Egypt and India and elsewhere. About 150 years have passed since then. The American people set the world an example in waging a revolutionary war against feudal slavery. And now they find themselves in a, yeah, so there you go. Yeah, I mean, that's him talking about the American Revolution. The representatives of the bourgeoisie understand that for the sake of overthrowing black slavery, of overthrowing the rule of slave owners, it was worth letting the country go through years of civil war, through the abysmal ruin, destruction, and terror of that accompanying war. But now, when we are confronted with the vast greater task of overthrowing capitalist wage slavery, overthrowing the rule of the bourgeoisie, the representatives of the bourgeoisie and their reformist socialists have been frightened. So that's Lenin talking about the Civil War. Let's read what Marx wrote about the Civil War. He wrote, "The working men, the true political power of the North, allowed slavery to defile their own republic, while before the black people, mastered and sold without his concurrence, they boasted it the highest prerogative of the white-skinned laborer to sell himself and choose his own master. They were unable to attain true freedom of labor or to support their European brethren in the struggle of emancipation. But this barrier to progress has been swept off by the Red Sea of civil war. The working men of Europe feel sure, as the American War of Independence initiated a new era of ascendancy for the middle class, so the American anti-slavery war will do for the working class. They consider it an earnest of the epoch to come that it fell to the lot of Abraham Lincoln, the single-minded son of the working class, to lead his country through the matchless struggle for the rescue of an enchained race and the reconstruction of a social world." Damn. Damn. I mean, if that's not a glowing endorsement of Lincoln in the Civil War, I don't know what is. This is from Marx's letter to Abraham Lincoln, published in 1864, in which Marx and the International Working Men's Association congratulated Abraham Lincoln for winning the 1864 election. Yeah, I mean, there's some other highlights in this letter, right? The working classes of Europe understood at once, even before the fanatic partnership of the upper classes of the Confederate gentry had given its dismal warning, that the slaveholders' rebellion was to sound the tocsin of a holy crusade of property against labor. And for that, the men of labor, with their hopes for the future and even their past conquests, were at stake in the tremendous conflict at the other side of the Atlantic. Everywhere they bore, therefore, patiently the hardships imposed on them by the cotton crisis, opposed enthusiastically the pro-slavery intervention of their betters, and for the most part of Europe contributed their quota of blood to the good cause. Wow. For the commencement of the titanic American strife, the working men of Europe felt instinctively that the Star-Spangled Banner carried the destiny of their class. The conquest of territories which opened up the dire epopehy was it not just to decide whether the virgin soil of immense tracts should be wielded for the labor of the immigrant or the prostituted by the tramp of the slave driver? Damn. Like, I mean, he's writing in this fiery language about why Lincoln was being supported, why the European workers, in Britain and France and Germany should support Abraham Lincoln. I mean, go and read Marx's letter. "We congratulate the American people on your re-election by a large majority. If the resistance of the slave power was the reversed watchword of your first election, the triumphant war cry of your re-election is death to slavery." That's how he begins the letter. Damn. That is Marx writing to Abraham Lincoln. It was the Second American Revolution. And Karl Marx only ever had 2 jobs in his life. Did you know this? He only ever had 2 jobs. One of those jobs was that he was a postal clerk, or he was a clerk for a railroad company. And the second job he had was he was the London correspondent for the New York Tribune. What was the New York Tribune? The New York Tribune was the Republican Party newspaper of New York City. And the New York Tribune was run by Horace Greeley. Horace Greeley was a progressive. He was a member of the U.S. Congress. He called himself a socialist. He wasn't a Marxist, though. He was like a religious utopian socialist. He was the guy who said, "Go west, young man." And Horace Greeley hired Karl Marx. So of all of Karl Marx's jobs he only had 2 jobs in his life. One of them was working for the Republican newspaper. Karl Marx was a Fox News correspondent, right? The Fox News, the Republican Party aligned mass media based in New York City of the 1840s was the New York Tribune. And Karl Marx was employed by the New York Tribune for years. So you could say that Karl Marx was a Fox News anchor back in the 1850s and 60s. I'm being facetious. Obviously, the political perspective of the Republican Party was very different back in the 1850s. But even the name Republican, right? The name Republican, where did that come from? In 1848, that's the year the Communist Manifesto was published, there were uprisings in almost every European country. According to some historians, there were over 200 armed uprisings in Europe in 1848. And every major European country, Britain, France, Germany, Czechoslovakia, Belgium, Luxembourg, all of them had mass revolts and uprisings. The biggest of which was the German Revolution of 1848. And those revolutions were explosive, those revolutions that happened. 1848 was called the Spring of Nations because there were so many uprisings and revolutions that happened in 1848 in Europe. And those uprisings were led by Republicans, people who advocated republics. In France, they wanted to bring back the republic. They wanted to topple the monarchy that had been imposed on them after the downfall of Napoleon. In France, they wanted a republic. They were demanding a republic. In Germany at that point didn't exist as a country. There were a number of different little principalities that were feudal, and the peasants rose up demanding the creation of a German nation state that would be governed by a republic. In Britain, you had uprisings elsewhere. And in 1848, the Spring of Nations, the rallying cry of the radicals was for the creation of a republic. And the Republicans in 1848 all across Europe, who were storming government buildings and taking up arms and beheading kings and tearing down statues and doing all these radical things, they waved the red flag, which was the color of the French Revolution. During the French Revolution, the revolutionaries would wear red hats. They were called red caps. And red was the color of revolutionaries. And so the red Republicans or the Republicans would storm into government buildings, and they were revolting all across Europe, demanding the creation of republics. And it was in the aftermath of what had happened in Europe, the 1848 revolts, that in the United States, a new political party was formed called the Republican Party. It was called the Republican Party because it was trying to be the American incarnation of that energy, that Spring of Nations energy that had spread through Europe, this revolutionary feeling. And one of the main groups of people who were joining the Republican Party were what were called free soilers. And those were small farmers who were moving out to the newly settled states like Illinois, Kansas, Iowa, places like that. Very good, John. And they were moving out to the newly settled states, and they did not want those states to be slave states. They wanted them to be free states. They did not want to see slavery expand. And these small farmers were very opposed to slavery. And the big plantation owners had inflated power in the U.S. government. You'll recall, many people point out that the U.S. Constitution describes black people as 3/5 of a human being. Now, do you know why it says that? That was a compromise, because the amount of seats that a state got in the Congress was based on the population. And the slave holders in the southern states wanted to have more seats in Congress, and they wanted to have more votes in the Electoral College. So they wanted to count their slaves in the population count. And of course, the northern states said, no, you can't. Slaves can't vote. They don't have human rights. So they can't be counted. So they reached a compromise. And that's why the US Constitution says that black people are 3/5 of a human being. So the power of the slave owners was inflated in the federal government. And the slave owners had the Supreme Court, and they had a lot of money, and Wall Street was with them. Now, there was no stock exchange at that point, but Wall Street was a place where there were a number of insurance companies that insured slave ships. And Wall Street began, interesting history, Wall Street began as the site of a slave market. And in addition to that, Wall Street was a place that a number of slavery-related financial institutions were set up that insured slave ships, that insured slave exports, the export of cotton from the South, etc. I'm glad you like it, Mariah. And Wall Street was very much tied in with London and their financial system, and the slaveholders, their votes were, the slave states were inflated very significantly in the federal government. And because of that, the slave owners had a kind of a monopoly on political power. What the slave owners wanted, and this is the most important thing, what the slave owners wanted for the United States and what the non-slave capitalists, what the industrial capitalists of the North wanted for the United States were very different. The slave owners wanted the United States to keep a primitive slave economy. They wanted the United States to be a lot of slave plantations, a lot of big, huge farms where slaves were being worked to death. That's what they wanted. However, the northern industrial capitalists, they wanted big cities with factories. They wanted technological progress. So there was a divide. And as new states were coming into the country, there was a divide about whether or not these new states that were coming in would be slave states or free states. And the free soilers, the small farmers, wanted them to be free states, not slave states. They didn't want to expand the power of the slave owners of the South that was already inflated in the government. Now, it's also important to point out that slavery in the United States was genocidal. I hate to dwell on ugly, gross things, but you got to talk about history. In Louisiana, there was a concentration camp, basically. I mean, it was a death camp. It was an Auschwitz in Louisiana. It was called Angola. And today there's a federal prison there. But in a place called, they named it after the African country of Angola. And this was a place that slaves were worked to death. There was a slave that was particularly rebellious or particularly unwanted or whatever. They would send them to Angola, which was a death camp where they would die after 1 or 2 years. And if you look at the body count for the Angola concentration camp, I mean, it was, I can just look it up. Angola slave plantation, Louisiana. I mean, it was horrendous. It was absolutely horrendous. The body count. I mean, now it's Louisiana State Penitentiary, known as Angola, but historically, it was a death camp. I mean, it was a place that people were worked to death. I don't even think they have a body count. I'm looking at the Wikipedia page for it. I don't even think they have a body count for it. But it was just many, many, many thousands and thousands of slaves were sent there to be worked to death and die. It was a death camp, basically. And you look at the conditions of what was going on. Slavery in the United States was genocidal. You know, I mean, people talk about the number of slaves who died, you know, in the transcontinental, you know, the process, the Middle Passage to the United States. But then even after that, it was genocidal. I mean, people were murdered. People, I mean, in their hundreds of thousands. I mean, it wasn't simply that people were held as unpaid laborers, as the property of other people, as horrendous as that is. It was also a murderous system. And slavery, in order for it to be maintained, you couldn't have technological progress because it was simply not efficient in terms of technology. Technology was making slavery less and less, you know, feasible and necessary in terms of technology. So the slaveholders of the South basically determined that to hold on to their power, they had to stop the United States from industrializing. They had to stop the United States from becoming a more industrialized society. So they were trying to hold back the economic progress of the United States. Well, the northern industrial capitalists didn't particularly care for that. Now, the labor movement also didn't particularly care for that. The labor movement in the United States, obviously, it's really hard to demand higher wages when you're competing with somebody who can work for free. And in the southern states of the United States, the wages of laborers, of non-slaves, of hired laborers were like the lowest in the world, in the Western world at that time, because they were competing with people who were working for free. And in many cases, you know, the conditions that non-slave, you know, workers, you know, that wage laborers had in the South were worse because they could afford to lose wage workers, but they couldn't afford to lose slaves. If you had a job where someone might die, you would hire a white person to do it because they might die. And if a slave died, then you're out. You lost you lost a piece of your property. If a wage worker dies, you just hire another one. So slavery was bad for everyone. Obviously, it was the worst for the black people who were, as property, had no rights whatsoever, millions of which were worked to death in places like the Angola concentration camp. But in addition to that, it was bad for the whole country. It was preventing the country from industrializing. It was decreasing the wages of all workers. Slavery was an economic disaster. It was an absolute economic disaster. But the Constitution was rigged so that the slave owners, their votes in the Electoral College and in the Congress were expanded. They had the British Empire behind them. They had the global financial system and Wall Street behind them. And so it seemed like the slave owners, despite the fact that they were hurting the country, seemed like they had all the power. And so, as a result of the slave owners having all the power and hurting the country economically, you got something called the Second Great Awakening. This is a really important event. It's a long event. The Second Great Awakening was a religious revival movement that, I guess some people even trace the origins of it back to 1795, but it really got going much later than that. It was a mass movement of religious outpourings, and all across the country, you had ministers preaching repentance all across the country and rallying the people in an explosion of religious faith and religious revivalism. But one of the main things that these pastors were preaching about was they said that America had to repent from the sin of slavery. They argued that slavery was sinful and immoral, and they argued that America needed to repent from the sin of slavery. And they were pushing individual repentance, forgiveness, confessing one's sins, turning one's life around, accepting Christ's forgiveness. They were pushing that while also emphasizing the evil of slavery. And many religious groups that are now considered a big part of American life came out of the Second Great Awakening. One of them, for example, is the Seventh Day Adventists. They came out of it. Another one that came out of this was Mormonism. A number of religious groups trace their roots back to the Second Great Awakening. It started with the mainline Protestant congregations, Presbyterians and others, Congregationalists, but it soon exploded into something completely different. And, you had many religious sects and movements that emerged from the Second Great Awakening. And it was just this mass explosion of religious fanaticism that spread through the United States, but it had a left-wing character. And that's what was quite interesting about it. Nowadays, we think of religion as being exclusively right-wing. And in the South, that was true. In the South, the churches said that slavery was in the Bible. The Bible commands slaves to obey their masters. So therefore, slavery was fine. However, the Second Great Awakening had a very different message. It argued that slavery was deeply immoral and inconsistent with Christian faith. It argued also that every individual person could develop their own connection with God, and that you didn't need a priest or a church to do it. You could develop your own connection with God. And it also tended to believe in women's rights, right? And this is very interesting. Seventh-day Adventism as a religion was led by a woman. And a number of these sects that emerged wanted women to have the right to vote, had women preachers, women pastors. There were a number of women pastors involved in the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening had a left-wing character. The main thing the Second Great Awakening was calling out was slavery. It was saying that slavery was immoral, that slavery had to be destroyed, that America needed to repent from the horrendous sin of slavery. But it was also saying women should have the right to vote, women should have equal rights. It was also saying that people needed to be involved in government. There needed to be an upsurge of democratic participation. It was saying a lot of things. The song Amazing Grace comes out of the Second Great Awakening. It was really the main theme song of the Second Great Awakening. And that song was written by a slave trader. Newton, I think was his name. And Newton, he had been a slave trader, and the story was there had been a storm, and he had a spiritual awakening amid this storm and promised God he would never engage in slave trading again. So he's turned the boat around, and he came back to the United States to become a Christian evangelist. Another tradition that comes out of the Second Great Awakening was tent revivals, right? That churches generally are done inside of the building. But the Second Great Awakening, instead, these preachers would go from town to town, and they'd set up a big tent, and they would just gather everyone they could find to come under the tent and listen to their preaching. The Second Great Awakening, my ancestor, Charles G. Finney, I'm descended from a guy named Charles G. Finney. He was one of the founders of Oberlin College. That's my ancestor. And he was one of the main pastors who was popular during the Second Great Awakening. He was starting these tent revival meetings. And that it was a widespread explosion of religious fanaticism. And it was sponsored by the Northern industrial capitalists. They were paying for it, right? It was the factory owners were paying for it. But they were trying to rile up the population to oppose slavery. There was a fight in the ruling class between the slave-owning bourgeoisie of the South and of Wall Street that was tied in with them, and the industrial Northern capitalists. And the industrial Northern capitalists wanted to settle states like Illinois and Indiana and Ohio, and they wanted those states to industrialize and not become slave states. And they were encouraging people to move out westward. That's why the slogan of the New York Tribune and Horace Greeley was "Go West, young man. Go West, young man." And at the same time, they were emphasizing that slavery needed to be repudiated. They needed to get rid of slavery. And it was this explosion of religious fanaticism that set the stage for the eventual formation of the Republican Party. And eventually the Republican Party found their guy that they wanted to be president of the United States. And his name was Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln was from Illinois, which was the Wild West back then. It was an unsettled state. It was a state that was, was full of unsettled territory. And Lincoln was a small town lawyer who had a reputation for sticking up for the common man against the rich. Abraham Lincoln gave a speech in Illinois where he called out the capitalists. What did he say? Lincoln, he said, this is what Abraham Lincoln said: "These capitalists generally act harmoniously and in concert to fleece the people. And now that they have gotten into a quarrel with themselves, we are called upon to appropriate the people's money to settle the quarrel." And he also, what did Lincoln say about labor? Lincoln also said, "Labor is prior to and independent of capital. Capital is only the fruit of labor and could never have existed if labor had not existed first. Labor is superior to capital and deserves a much higher consideration." That's Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was not a communist. He was not a socialist, but he was considered to be a radical. He was a champion of the common man. He was a critic of the capitalists. He was a supporter of labor and workers' rights. And Abraham Lincoln was a populist. And he was from the wild country of Illinois. And he was this small town lawyer who had fought for the common man. And when Abraham Lincoln was elected president, you'll recall he very famously did not want to abolish slavery. He said he thought abolishing slavery was going too far. He said he just didn't want slavery to expand. That was Abraham Lincoln's position. He just didn't want slavery to expand. No more slave states. He also felt that states had the right to not cooperate with the fugitive slave law. Right? The slave owners had passed this law. It said if a slave broke free and ran away to a non-slave state, that state was obligated to send them back to the South. And Abraham Lincoln and other Republicans said, no, there is no obligation. We shouldn't have to cooperate with slavery. And largely, after Abraham Lincoln was elected, the slave owners of the South revolted not because they were afraid. We've always been told that the Civil War was about states' rights. It was about states' rights, but that wasn't true. It was actually about refusal on the part of the federal government to accommodate slavery. Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans and the sweeping mass movement that opposed slavery was saying that the federal government should stop accommodating slavery. That's all they were saying. They weren't even saying to get rid of slavery. They were just saying, we don't think that the rest of the country has any obligation to send slaves back to you if they break free. And we don't want the new states that come into the country to be slave states. If you want to do your slavery thing in the South, okay, we'll let you do that. But we're not going to accommodate you any longer. The federal government of the United States is not going to accommodate you any longer. That's basically what Lincoln was saying. He said he wasn't going to abolish slavery. He was just going to stop the federal government accommodating and facilitating slavery. And if you read the secession document that a number of states had, they said this explicitly, that they were seceding from the United States. They were leaving the country because the federal government was not going to accommodate slavery any longer. And they felt this was a violation. And they felt the federal government should have to accommodate slavery. Lincoln got elected, and the southern states took up arms against the federal government in defense of slavery. They said that slavery was so important that, the fact that Lincoln got in there and was going to stop having the federal government accommodate slavery, Lincoln was a threat to the power of the slave owners, so they took up arms against him. And in order to defeat the slave owners, Abraham Lincoln had to form a coalition. And that coalition included labor unionists, it included small farmers, it included, Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, and it was a broad coalition. Little known fact that in the US Civil War, no one knows about this, there was a communist general, August Willich, was a brigadier general in the US Army during the Civil War. He was a German communist who had been part of the 1848 revolution, and after that revolution lost, he fled to the United States, and he was a well-known military guy, lots of experience, and so he was promoted to the rank of general. He was a brigadier general. Read about August Willich. August Willich was somebody that was in Lincoln's army who was a brigadier general. And interestingly, August Willich had at one point tried to kill Karl Marx. He and Karl Marx had a rivalry and they'd fought with each other. He and Karl Marx made up, and throughout the Civil War, August Willich and Karl Marx were in correspondence. And August Willich was a member of the International Working Men's Association, was regularly communicating with Karl Marx throughout the war. A general in the army, was an open communist and was communicating with Karl Marx. In addition to that, in Ohio, there were a number of Germans who had fled Germany after the 1848 revolution, who were communists and were taking their political leadership from Karl Marx. And they decided to form their own regiment. And so they formed the Ohio 9th Infantry Regiment. Read about the Ohio 9th Infantry Regiment. Ohio 9th Infantry Regiment. The Ohio 9th Infantry Regiment was a communist regiment in the U.S. Armed Forces. There was a communist division of the Union Army during the Civil War. The Ohio 9th Infantry Regiment. It was a wing of the U.S. Army made up of German immigrants, and they waved a red flag as their official emblem, and they marched into battle singing the anthem of the French Revolution, La Marseillaise, and their leader was a guy named Joseph Weydemeyer. Read about this. Joseph Weydemeyer, who was also a communist, was their leader. This is some important history. And Joseph Weydemeyer, another German guy, he was their leader. And this is some amazing history, right? This is some amazing history. And you'll never hear about this. You'll never hear about this. But in order to defeat slavery, the working class of the United States had to enter an alliance with the capitalist class, and it was a coalition. And slavery being defeated was a big step forward. And the other thing that people are not generally aware of is that after the U.S. Civil War ended, there was briefly a period where they were redistributing the land of the slave owners, where black people and low-income white people were having the land of the slave owners redistributed to them, where they set up public schools in the South. And for a brief period, free, poor white people and black people were aligned. There was kind of a political alliance among them. And their Reconstruction in the United States, the aftermath of the Civil War, where black people were voting, black people were elected to legislatures, was actually a very hopeful time. And living conditions for white people and black people were vastly improving when the Union Army was in the South, when they were redistributing the land, and when they were locking former Confederates out of the political system. Now, Reconstruction was betrayed, and the betrayal of Reconstruction, where they pulled the U.S. troops out of the South, was a big setback. That's what led to Jim Crow segregation and all of that. But you look at the history, the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, when they started redistributing the land, when they were providing schools and education, it was a big moment where you saw a lot of progressive things happening. A lot of radical things were happening. And Reconstruction was a pretty good moment. And this has all been erased by history. You know, they show you movies like Gone with the Wind that erase all of this. Little known fact. So, you know, the Pledge of Allegiance was written by a socialist. And I've told you all of this many times. Francis Bellamy was a Baptist minister who was a socialist, and he was also, you know, his cousin Edward Bellamy wrote the novel Looking Backward, which was a best-selling science fiction novel in the 1880s. But little known fact, where did Francis Bellamy get the words for the U.S. Pledge of Allegiance? Where did he get the words? Well, the words for the U.S. Pledge of Allegiance came from the oaths that former Confederate soldiers had to take. You know, in order to get your voting rights back, if you'd taken up arms and been part of the Confederacy, in order to get your right to vote back, you had to take an oath of loyalty to the United States. And if you actually listen to the words of the Pledge of Allegiance, they're quite radical for the time. What are the words of the U.S. Pledge of Allegiance? Think of the context, right? There had just been a huge armed uprising in the United States by slaveholders to try and preserve slavery, to try and preserve keeping black people as property, and break the country apart in order to preserve it. So if you listen to the words of the U.S. Pledge of Allegiance, they're actually very radical. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic, right? So that's itself like an homage to the Republican revolts, republicanism, radicalism, for which it stands, one nation. Now, it doesn't say one country. It says one nation. And it's saying all the people of the United States are one nationality, which I would argue even today they are not. But it's saying that black people and white people, Catholics, Protestants, are one nationality, one nation. Now, nation is not the same as country. A country is just a geographic area with a government, but a nation, a nationality, like Germans or Frenchmen or English or Scots or, you know, saying one nation, that all the people in the United States are one single nationality. That was a very radical thing to say. Indivisible. What does indivisible mean? It means it can't be broken apart. Indivisible. So no separation, no Confederates, no secession. Indivisible. With liberty, no slaves. That's what, with liberty, meaning no slaves, and justice, no slaves for all. You actually listen to the original words of the U.S. Pledge of Allegiance, which were taken from this oath. It was very radical. It was an extremely radical pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, no secession. It's like a gang. Once you join the United States, you can't leave, right? There's no exit of the United States. Indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. It was quite radical for the time. Now, obviously, nowadays, this is just taken for granted. But at the time, you can imagine that, you know, for former Confederates and former slave owners to have to take this oath, it was basically surrender. You had to surrender. Like, you were surrendering all the principles of the Confederacy. You can't divide the United States. You are the same nationality as every other person in this country. You're the same nation. And there will be no slavery in this country, and there will be no secession in this country. Now, interestingly, the words "under God" were added to the Pledge of Allegiance during the 1950s, as was pointed out in the chat. it was the Knights of Columbus, which was the Roman Catholic fraternal organization. They took a petition asking that the words "under God" be added to the Pledge of Allegiance to separate America from the godless communists, the communist atheists. However, what's also interesting is the reason they said "one nation under God, indivisible" is that actually comes from the Gettysburg Address, right? In the Gettysburg Address, right, which is a very short speech given by Abraham Lincoln that many people memorize, right? They used to make kids in schools memorize it because it was so short, right? It was this very short but poetic speech that Abraham Lincoln gave. In the Gettysburg Address, the famous Gettysburg Address, which was, was just like 3-paragraph speech he gave, he uses the phrase that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. However, if you look at that quote, if you look at that phrase, this nation under God, what he's saying is it doesn't mean this nation is religious. It doesn't mean this nation has a state religion. It actually means God willing. It's like inshallah. He's saying the last line of the Gettysburg Address is that we highly resolve that these dead men shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. What he's saying is God willing, right? If God wills it, we're going to have a new birth of freedom. That's what it meant, that under God, like if God allows it, right? If this is God's will, these men won't have died in vain. If this is God's will, if we don't know the future, but, we'll have a new birth of freedom. That's what he's saying. That's where they got the idea from it. So even the way it's used in the Pledge of Allegiance is not a correct understanding. The phrase "under God" in the time that Abraham Lincoln was speaking, it had a different meaning. It meant God willing, or we don't know what's going to. It meant inshallah, right? Muslims say inshallah, like if God wills it. That's what it means. So the way it was inserted into the Pledge of Allegiance is not correct. So that's an interesting bit of history there. But the ruling class of the United States, I mean, for years, I don't know if you've all heard about Gone with the Wind, which is a disgusting propaganda film that makes it sound as if the South was the paradise, before the Civil War, and then says, oh, the poor South, slavery, was awful, and slavery, the overthrow of slavery was awful. I mean, it's a propaganda film. I was taught in school that Reconstruction was horrible, and we were so mean to the South. And for generations, the ruling class of the United States has done everything they can to erase the history of the Civil War, and to just erase that history. And they have worked really, really hard to try and cover up that history. And what's interesting is that now, I would argue that they're talking about it, in their own way. But even the way they're talking about it now is not correct. For example, the 1619 Project, the way they talk about it is not correct. Slavery was bad, obviously, for the enslaved people who were genocided, worked to death, treated as property. It was also bad for white people. White people in the South had horrendous working conditions, low wages, and in many parts of the South, there were armed uprisings by Southern whites in support of the North. Free State of Jones. Go see the movie or watch the movie Free State of Jones. There was a county in Mississippi? Right. Jones County, where the poor white people took up arms against the Confederate government and joined with the slaves because they were against the Confederacy. The Confederacy was so bad for them. The Free State of Jones. Go and it's about in 1863, the Mississippi Rebellion, where the poor white people teamed up with the black people and broke Jones County away from Mississippi. And that there was an understanding that slavery was bad for white people. It was bad for all working people. It was bad for all working people. And the defeat of slavery and Reconstruction in the South led to public schools for Southern white people for the first time. It led to the redistribution of land of the slave owners. It was a victory for all working people in America when slavery was defeated. All working people in America benefited from slavery being defeated. And slavery, when it existed, was bad for the entire country. As I talked about before, slavery was holding back the industrialization of the country. Slavery was preventing the country from advancing technology. Slavery was bad for America in every conceivable way. And that's why the ruling class of the United States, one wing of it, had to, launch a populist uprising to overthrow it. And they had to build a class collaborationist united front with the small farmers and with the labor unions and with the Marxists and with Harriet Tubman and others. They had to build a class collaborationist united front, and they had to unleash the forces of revolution to defeat it. And they had to have a populist like Abraham Lincoln, and they had to stage a revolution. They had to have a revolution to overthrow it because it was bad for the country. However, if you listen to what the woke people are saying now, they don't think that. They would argue, and I got so angry. I was watching a long time ago. I was watching one of those John Oliver, right? He does, Last Week Tonight or whatever. I was watching it, and he was talking about Confederate monuments. And he was making it sound like the Confederacy was good for white workers. I mean, it was awful. He was really making it sound like that. And that is the woke narrative. The wokes believe what the white supremacists believe. They believe in Gone with the Wind. They just want you to feel guilty about it. The wokes think that slavery was good for white people, right? I mean, W.E.B. Du Bois and the Marxist historians have spent pages and pages and pages debunking the lie that somehow slavery was good for the overwhelming majority of white people, that white people should be sympathetic with the Confederacy, that, they spent years, Marxists have spent years debunking the Gone with the Wind narrative, right? And explaining that no, slavery was bad for the whole country. And, and when it was defeated, that was a great step forward for all working people. Marxists have spent years making that argument. Wokes come along and they say that slavery was good for all white people, that they should just feel guilty about it. It's really weird. The Ku Klux Klan and the wokes both hold on to this historical mythology that says somehow slavery was good for white Americans. It wasn't. It wasn't good for white Americans. It wasn't good for the overwhelming majority of the population. Slavery was only good for Wall Street bankers and plantation owners and the British Empire. It was bad for the country. But white supremacists, for years, white supremacists have been trying to push this historical revisionism, claiming that somehow slavery, things were better for the white people of the South during the time of slavery, which is a lie. And wokes also promote this mythology. They just feel that white people should be morally shamed for it. When the class line that you get from William C. Foster, that you get from W.E.B. Du Bois, that you get from, Herbert Aptheker and the great Marxist historians, that you get from those who use scientific Marxism to explain American history, the line that they have always had is that slavery was bad. And Marx, I just read you what Marx said. Marx was saying that slavery was bad. It's shocking to me to see them do this. That wokeism basically accepts the white supremacist narrative, the Gone with the Wind narrative. It just has a different spin on it, that you should be guilty about it. The Confederate flag is an offensive, awful symbol. And the reason it's an offensive and awful symbol is because it's the symbol of a group of people that took up arms against the American government in order to preserve a genocidal, barbaric system called slavery. So the Confederate flag is an awful symbol. But starting in the 1970s, there was an effort to make the Confederate flag the symbol of poor white people. There was a TV program called Dukes of Hazzard. And it was about couple low-income white people in what, Kentucky or West Virginia or something, and they had a big Confederate flag on their car. And it's supposed to be like they were working class white people. And they've tried really, really hard to make the Confederate flag the symbol of low-income white people. I think they did a study at one point that said the majority of Confederate flags are sold in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana. They've tried to convince low-income white people that anti-racism is bad for them, that anti-racism is bad for them, and that the Confederacy and racism and these things are good for them. And they're not. They're not in any conceivable way. I mean, if you look at the history, the racism weakened the labor movement and all the gains. You want to talk about those good paying industrial jobs in the North? They didn't start paying good wages in the auto plants or on the docks of San Francisco until there was multiracial labor unions. It wasn't until the Communist Party came along and integrated the labor unions. Until then, when the labor unions were run by racists, every time there was a strike, the bosses would just hire the black people. And that the racism hurt the labor movement very significantly. You want to talk about those good paying industrial jobs? You wouldn't have had those if it hadn't been for anti-racism, if it hadn't been for the Communist Party saying black and white unite and fight and putting black people into the leadership of labor unions. If it hadn't been for the Communist Party organizing the dock workers of San Francisco and bringing black people into the dock working jobs and the leadership of the dock workers unions in San Francisco, if it hadn't been that, if it hadn't been for that, you would never have had good paying dock worker jobs. I mean, it's like there's many examples of this throughout history. At the Flint sit-down strike in 1937, the only black worker in the plant was a janitor, right? But when they marched out of the plant victorious in 1937, he was the one that they had carry the American flag to make a political statement, right? And that racism hurt all working people. It hurt all working people. Obviously, it hurt the target of racism the most by far. But the job of communists in America, historically, our job has been at the top of our lungs, pointing out that racism hurts all workers and that class solidarity is the way forward, that on the picket line, you stand shoulder to shoulder with your brothers, and by putting the needs of the most oppressed first, you lift up all working people, right? By demanding that black workers get hired on the docks, you advanced all the dock workers because you got rid of the racism that the bosses used to hurt the labor movement. The slogan of the Communist Party, USA, in the 1930s was black and white, unite and fight. And that slogan historically has been what has advanced the labor movement. And what's interesting is that wokes don't believe that. Wokes believe that slavery, Jim Crow segregation was somehow good for poor white people. And then they get mad at poor white people for waving a Confederate flag. Well, if you tell somebody that their life, that something is good for them, why would you not expect them to do it? If you put up a sign somewhere, it says, buy this flower, why would you get mad at somebody for buying that flower? Wokes go around telling low-income white workers that that slavery was good for them, that Jim Crow segregation was good for them, that racism is good for them, that the Confederate flag is a symbol of advocating their interests. And then they get mad at poor white workers for waving the Confederate flag. Well, the job of communists historically has been to go to white workers and say that Confederate flag is not good for you. That represents Wall Street. That represents the plantation owners. That represents the people who drove your wages down. Our job is to say to white people, that Confederate flag is offensive to you. That represents your ancestors being conscripted to go die for Wall Street, to go die for a bunch of slave-owning plantation owners. That symbol should be just as offensive to white people in the South. They should see that flag and be disgusted by it. The Confederate flag stands for a time when they were ground into poverty and sent off to get shot and forcibly conscripted to go die for Wall Street and the plantation owners. I mean, you know, and that's our job. That is our job as Marxists. We are there to explain this, and wokeism doesn't do that. And that's why we have to fight wokeism. And it's not easy to fight wokeism. It's so easy to just tail after wokeism. Just go along with it, right? It's trendy. It's hip, right? It's easier to talk to them. They say they believe in socialism. They're not hostile. They don't cringe when you say the word socialism. But it might be the easy thing to do, but we have a responsibility to do what needs to be done. And the Civil War, you know, teaching the American people what the Civil War was really about, how there were divisions in the ruling class, how that created an opening for the people, how, you know, it started out as just an effort to contain slavery, and pretty soon it turned into a broad, sweeping movement that abolished slavery and was redistributing land. How this was the one moment where the American capitalists were playing a revolutionary and progressive role because they had to. They had no choice. Slavery was cutting into their profits. It was keeping the country poor. It was preventing them from industrializing. The slave owners had the country hostage. And so the rest of the capitalist class said, oh, God damn it, we're going to have to hire Karl Marx to write for the New York Tribune. We're going to have to let August Willich become a brigadier general. We're going to have to make Harriet Tubman the first woman to lead soldiers into battle. God damn it. You can tell they did it kicking and screaming the whole way. They didn't want to do it. But the ruling class of the United States, the bourgeoisie of the United States, was forced into a revolutionary position. And as a result of that, they unleashed a social explosion that immediately after the Civil War, they were scrambling to contain, right? They themselves, they created Lincoln and they killed Lincoln, right? They created the radical Republicans, and then they had to move against the radical Republicans. Eventually, the radical Republicans broke away. They formed the Populist Party. You know, and the Republican Party became an imperialist party and purged its ranks of what they called the radical Republicans, who were wanting to redistribute land, were wanting to nationalize the railroads, etc. So the ruling class themselves have been retreating ever since then. But we have a responsibility to study the actual history of the Civil War and use it to get people to understand how it is you advance the interests of the working class in our time. So I hope that people have found these opening remarks to be interesting. You know, I just thought this was an important thing to talk about. So hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. That concludes my opening remarks for tonight. And I think now we'll do the roll call. We'll find out who's on the other side of the camera. So names and locations. I will call folks out as I see them. Names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations. Who is with us? Names and locations. We got Lawrence Johnson in Chicago. Rise from Adelaide, Australia. Jonathan C. in Los Angeles. We got Valley from Ohio, Rupert from England, Jenny Lynn in Cincinnati, Ryan in Kansas City. Welcome, Ryan. Killian in Milwaukee, JT24 in Mississippi. We got Minor Threat in California, Tadig in Dublin, New Mexico, Che Guevara, Mark in Mission, Texas, Tyler in southeastern Missouri. We got Tristan in Costa Rica. You're doing a lot of traveling, Tristan. Miami, Florida, Phil. We got New Mexico, London, Canada, James. We got Jamie in St. Paul, Richmond, Virginia. We got Cleveland, Pirate Alex. We got Bob Troy in New York, Salt Lake City, Utah, Farid in Northern California, Brighton on Lori's front teeth. Okay, what does that mean? That's weird, right? Ecuador, West Virginia, Alex in Beijing, West Virginia, Redneck Red. We got Jamie in St. Paul. We got John McCarthy in Chicago, Auckland, New Zealand, right? Where else? We've got Patty and Joshua Tree. Shout out to you, longtime friend of the show. Stephen in Auckland, New Zealand. Welcome. We got Zephyr in Eugene, Oregon. We got Bergen County Christian from northern New Jersey. We got Alex from Brazil. Ecuador is in the house. Mariah from North Carolina is with us tonight. I may be in Jenny's basement, though. Wow, Brighton is like stalking all the women on this live. We all appreciate that, Brighton, sarcastically. Christian in New Jersey is Bergen County repping. Very, very, very good. Welcome, everybody. Welcome. Ryan in Utah is here. Very good. Very good. Anybody else, names and locations? If not, I have some super chats here to answer. But if anyone has anything else they want me to talk about, I will happily do so. I will happily talk about it. Send me a super chat, and I guess I will start answering super chat questions. But if people have more things they want me to talk about, send me a super chat. First super chat question: look into your crystal ball and make predictions for 2024. The way I see it right now is the Democrats want the Republicans to have to nominate Donald Trump because there is some kind of agreement among the American elite that Donald Trump will not be allowed to get the presidency. They have determined through various mechanisms that they will make sure Donald Trump is not reelected. So the Democrats right now are trying to maneuver to make sure the Republicans have to nominate Donald Trump. That way, the Democrats are guaranteed to win because they will prevent it. The Republicans, on the other hand, and I think that there's a very good chance that the Republicans are probably going to win 2024 without Donald Trump. That's probably what's going to happen, is the Republican Party will find some way to not nominate Donald Trump, and we will get a Republican president in 2024. Whether or not it's Ron DeSantis, that's what everyone's saying now, but I'm not sure it'll be him, honestly. We're too far out at this moment. I feel like there may be somebody more charismatic in the wings, but it'll be someone of Ron DeSantis's political variety who is against wokeism, but without any substance. I have noticed in many of the popular culture, the fact that they just put Bill Maher on CNN, the fact that, Saturday Night Live is just endlessly taking digs at wokeism. They can tell the population is tired of wokeism, and the Biden administration is going down in flames. They're absolutely miserable. However, at the same time, they don't want Trump back. So I'm expecting that the only chance the Democrats have is if Trump is the nominee, because there's enough of a gentleman's agreement among the ruling class that Trump will never be allowed back in. But my prediction is we're going to get not Ron DeSantis, but a Ron DeSantis-like Republican. That's my prediction. Any popular organizations that push the true narrative of the Civil War? Are they all controlled opposition? All right. All righty. So there we go. That's my prediction. Thoughts on RFK entering the race? I am so glad he's doing that. I am so glad that Robert Kennedy Jr. is running because it is going to be so hard for them to manage this because he's a Kennedy, right? I mean, he's the son of RFK Sr. He's JFK's, nephew. And they are going to have to let him on the stage. And to some degree or other, they're going to marginalize him. But it's going to be really hard for them to do it because he's from such an important political family in the United States. And I love that. And they're going to marginalize him. They're not going to treat him as a real candidate. But it's going to be a really bad look for them. And they're going to have to tap dance around how they do it. And they're going to have to let him talk more than they would let somebody else talk. And he's a vaccine critic, and he's a critic of U.S. foreign policy. Now, I know he's said a lot of things about environmentalism that I don't agree with.
And, I mean, he's really into the climate change stuff. And, I'm not with him on that kind of thing. But when I think it's really great. I think it's a really, really great thing that he's running. I think it's really awesome. And that I think he will, he will shake up the race. Absolutely. And having him as the candidate having him running and participating is a really, really great thing. I think it's really, really great. All right. Next question. Did Lenin kill the anarchist and why? Well, the anarchists, first of all, right? Anarchism is a political persuasion. Yes, there were anarchists who were killed by Lenin, but yet, you have to specify. There was an event in the Soviet Union's early history called the Kronstadt Uprising. And that was essentially when the Bolsheviks were trying to centralize the government to win the Civil War, right? After the Russian Revolution, many, many different countries invaded the Soviet Union. They were invaded by the British. They were invaded by the Germans. They were invaded by, the United States. There were a number of U.S. soldiers who were sent over there. The U.S. Marine Corps was sent over there. There were a number of countries that invaded Russia after the Russian Revolution. And in the context of the Civil War, the Bolsheviks were trying to set up a strong central government to coordinate the military effort to repel the invaders. Now, in that context, there was a port, where there were a lot of sailors who had been radicals and leftists for many years. It was called Kronstadt. And at Kronstadt, there were a number of sailors and dock workers and others who were anarchists who raised the slogan, "Soviets without communists." That was the slogan they raised, meaning they wanted independent workers' councils, but no central communist party. Soviets without communists. And in the middle of a war, when the country was being invaded, when they were being attacked, they took up arms against the Bolsheviks. And the Bolsheviks had to crush the Kronstadt Uprising. And it was bloody. And it was considered to be a horrendous tragedy in the Russian Revolution. They didn't want to do what they had to do. And they considered it to be their own comrades who they killed at the Kronstadt Uprising. Right? These were their own comrades who had fought with them against the Tsar, who'd fought with them to create the Soviet government. But when it came time to centralize the government, they were fighting against them. And in the context of a civil war where you have to have military discipline, when people are dying, you have to centralize authority. And it was a really tragic event, the Kronstadt Revolt. A really good place. Read about it in the history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Right, this is the official history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, short course. A lot of it was written by Stalin, published in 1936. And there's a section on the Kronstadt Uprising, right? I'll read it to you. Let me see. Kronstadt. Let me find the part about it, right? I believe, what was it, 1921, or was it earlier than that? Because I want to find this part. It was about the workers' opposition. Yeah. I'm trying to. It's been a while since I've read this book. Yeah. $241. Yeah. Right. Left communists, acting in conjunction with the social revolutionaries and Mensheviks, fought Lenin over these questions too. Bukharin, Osinsky, and others were opposed to the introduction of discipline, one-man management of enterprises, or the employment of bourgeois experts in industry, and the introduction of efficient business methods. They slandered Lenin by claiming that this policy would mean a return to bourgeois conditions. At the same time, the left communists preached the Trotskyite view that socialist construction and the victory of socialism in Russia was impossible. The left phraseology of the left communists served to camouflage their defense of the kulaks, the idlers, and the profiteers who were opposed to discipline and hostile to state regulation of economic life, to accounting and control. Having settled on the principles of organization of the new Soviet industry, the party proceeded to tackle the problems of the countryside, which at this period was in the throes of the struggle between the poor peasants and the kulaks. The kulaks were gaining strength and seizing the lands confiscated by the landlords. The poor peasants needed assistance. Yeah. This is interesting. It talks about the left communist opposition. That's anarchists, basically, and their fights against the Bolshevik Party in the early years. Right. After the Fifth Congress of Soviets, which opened on July 8th of 1918, the left socialist revolutionaries launched a fierce attack on Lenin in defense of the kulaks. They demanded the discontinuation of the fight against the kulaks and of the dispatch of workers' food detachments to the countryside. When the left socialist revolutionaries saw that the majority of the Congress was firmly opposed to their policy, they started a revolt in Moscow, from which they began to shell the Kremlin. This foolhardy outbreak was put down by the Bolsheviks within a few hours. Attempts at the revolt were made by left socialist revolutionaries in other parts of the country, but everywhere these outbreaks were speedily suppressed. There you go. Yeah, I mean, that's talking about the left socialist revolutionary party. That was the anarchist party that was associated with Peter Kropotkin, the socialist revolutionary party. The wing of it that initially supported the Bolsheviks was called the left socialist revolutionaries. They launched an armed uprising against the Bolshevik party in 1918 that was quickly put down. They were shelling the Kremlin. There you go. So, yeah, trying to see the part about the Kronstadt revolt in here. But yeah, I mean, look, in any revolution, right? Anytime you have an armed revolution, when a revolution becomes straight up violent, it's very hard to determine when it ends, because you're always going to have people who think it's not over yet. That's the problem with any armed revolution. And that often, I mean, they talk about this. There's a book called The Anatomy of a Revolution, and it talks about how revolutions go through phases. Right. And, one of those phases is called Thermidor, right? Because after the French Revolution, you had the French Revolution, you had the Reign of Terror, and then you had what was called the Thermidor. And that was a period where they executed a lot of revolutionaries. And there's like a power struggle among the revolutionaries, and the chaos or the terror ends with revolutionaries executing other revolutionaries. And that tends to be, in most armed revolutions, that happens, right? That there's always many different factions that are involved in overthrowing the old order, and it's not clear that the revolution is over. And at some point, it's over, right? Great example in the Islamic Revolution of Iran, right? The Shah was brought down. Khomeini became the new leader. There were a number of Iranian communists who thought that, they were going to continue and they were going to have a communist revolution. And for a while, there was a cleric, an Islamic cleric, who was very much a communist, who was aligned with Khomeini. Khomeini fired him and removed him, probably due to geopolitical stuff with the Soviet Union. And after that, the Mujahideen Khalq, the MEK, which was this Islamo-Marxist sect in Iran, launched a killing spree. I mean, and they went on bombings and et cetera, because they thought the revolution was going to keep going. After that, there were a lot of executions in Iran of Iranian communists because they thought the revolution wasn't over yet. And that when you have an armed revolution, a violent armed revolution, it's not clear when it's over. And that you'll get one group that says, okay, we're in charge now. And you get other people saying, well, maybe we're going to keep going with this revolution so we can be in charge. And that you have what's called Thermidor, right? The term Thermidor. The French Revolution was very much the revolution that was the point of reference in the Marxist movement of Europe. The Thermidorian reaction, they call it, which is a moment in the revolution when, let's the term Thermidorian reaction. In historiography of the French Revolution, the Thermidorian reaction is the common term for the period between the ousting of Robespierre and the inauguration of the French Directory. The Thermidorian Revolution was named after the month in which the coup took place, and it marked the end of the Reign of Terror, decentralization of the executive powers from the Committee of Public Safety. And that there's a period they talk about the Thermidorian reaction with the Thermidor, and that there was a Thermidor in Russia. I mean, in the Russian Revolution, there was a period where the terror had to end. The chaos that comes in the aftermath of an armed revolution has to end. And that's why, again, violent revolutions are not desirable. I really wish people could get that through their heads. Living through an actual violent revolution is awful. It's awful. And we don't want a violent revolution in America. You don't want to live through a violent revolution, right? Anyone who has lived through a violent revolution, many people will tell you it was necessary, but it was awful. It was absolutely awful, right? Violent revolutions involve a lot of people dying, and they're not pleasant at all, right? I mean, the Cuban Revolution, I greatly admire Fidel Castro and his bravery, but the Civil War that tore Cuba apart, and then Fidel came in, and there were a lot of executions, a lot of people sent to the firing squads. Not pleasant, not good. Maybe it was necessary, and there's many Cubans who think it was necessary, but it was not a good thing. And you don't want that kind of thing to happen in your country. You don't, right? In Iran, I met many Iranians who have said the reason that there will never be a counter-revolution in Iran is that even the people in Iran who hate the Islamic Republic the most, the rich people in northern Tehran who who love America and hate the Islamic Republic, they will never take up arms against the Islamic Republic because they all remember what it was like in 1979. And they remember the chaos there was in Iran and the executions, that followed the revolution and the chaos and the bloodshed. And they look at Syria now and the attempted revolution the USA tried to pull off there. They look at Libya now and they say, no, we don't want that to happen in our country. Maybe we don't like the Islamic Republic. Maybe we don't like Khamenei and the supreme leader, but we don't want that to happen to our country, right? That Marxists that are responsible advocate a peaceful transition to socialism through the democratic process. We don't advocate civil war, and we don't advocate a violent revolution. And, Lori says it. The Bolshevik Revolution was not a fun time, and she is right. And can you imagine, right, that there's this group of people, you're the Bolsheviks, and there's this group, the Left Social Revolutionary Party, and they were your comrades. They fought with you in the revolution. They sung the same songs as you. They were chanted the same slogans. And now they want to keep the revolution going and overthrow you. And you say, no, the revolution stopped. You got to kill them. These were people that had to line up their friends against the wall and shoot them, right? There's an element of, we have no idea. We cannot relate to these conditions. We can't. We cannot relate to these conditions. The kind of conditions that happen in countries that have violent revolutions are beyond anything we can comprehend. Violent revolutions are very ugly. I was just telling you about the Civil War. Look into the details of how awful the U.S. Civil War was. That again, you don't want a violent revolution. And yeah, in a violent revolution, not only do the revolutionaries have to kill people from the old order, but usually after the revolution is victorious, they then have to kill people within the revolutionary camp who want to keep the revolution going. And it's really ugly and messy and unpleasant. And often, the immediate aftermath of a revolution is extremely authoritarian. I tell a lot of people, they say to me, oh, Caleb, Stalin was blah, 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 blah. Well, what about Lenin? Lenin was, a lot of bloodshed happened under Lenin's leadership. When the Bolsheviks, first took power in St. Petersburg, they outlawed the drinking of alcohol, and they instituted the death penalty for drinking alcohol. I cannot ever imagine a situation where I would kill somebody for drinking alcohol. But when you're in military conditions, You know, when you're fighting a civil war and your country's barricaded and invaded, you know, people have to adopt very authoritarian conditions. And that's what people don't seem to understand. So, you know, did the Bolsheviks kill anarchists? Yep. And anarchists killed Bolsheviks. And it was an ugly situation. And that's why we shouldn't advocate violent revolution. That's why we should advocate a peaceful transition to socialism. All right. Use of the trans question as a wedge issue. Look, my position on the trans question makes everyone mad. Makes everybody mad. Nobody likes my position on the trans question, which is love your neighbor as yourself. Obviously, people that are trans are not having a good time. Not a pleasant thing to feel like one's in the wrong body, to feel like one's body is at odds with who one truly is. The feelings that trans people describe are not good feelings. And there's nothing that horrifies me more than bullying people like that, shaming people like that, making fun of people like that, not having sympathy for people like that. That's awful. And I sympathize with trans people. I want them to be protected from those who would harm them, those who would bully them, those who would make fun of them, those who would make their lives worse. And I also believe that, look, if you're an adult, you have the right to live your life however you want, right? Whatever surgery you want as an adult, you can do. Whatever drugs you want to take as an adult, recreational, medicinal, or otherwise, you can do. So sympathy for what trans people go through, and live and let live. Everyone has the right to live their life as they choose. That said, when it comes to some of the issues that relate to imposing on other people's rights, I don't know what the answer is. I don't. You know, whenever I open my mouth about any of those issues, immediately a bunch of people come at me from either side who tell me a whole bunch of facts that I don't know. And I don't want to know. I just don't want to have the debate. Women's sports, I don't know. You know, the bathroom thing and women's sports. And I don't know. And, you know, I hear people tell me about the impact that this stuff has on children. And I hear what they're saying and it scares me a lot. But then other people come at me and say, well, actually, Caleb, it's like, I don't know. Okay. What I do know is that every adult should be able to do whatever they want to their body. Not my business. What I do know is that the people that are trans, consider themselves to be trans, are suffering. They are in a lot of pain, and that it is my duty as a Christian to give them love and to not do anything to make their life worse. And that's one thing I will say that has always bothered me. Why in the world would you target somebody because they're miserable? I mean, I don't know. It's like, you know, somebody's walking down the road and one of their legs are broken. And so you're like, your leg is broken, and you break their other leg. Like, why? Why do people do this kind of behavior? This is savage, inhuman behavior. You see someone who's trans and they're suffering, why would you try to make them worse? Oh, you're trans. I'm going to make it worse for you because you've already got it bad, and you've got it bad. I'm going to make it worse for you. I mean, why act that way? That's savage, immoral human behavior. I mean, that's acting like an animal. It's acting like an awful person. I just don't understand that. That said, when you demand that I agree with you about women's sports, I'm not ready to do that. I'm not ready to go to the barricades against you yet, because I'm not convinced. Every time I open my mouth about it, somebody comes at me with all kinds of facts, and I just don't care about it, right? The position that we've always taken in CPI, and there are trans members of CPI, the position that we have always taken is this. If you're trans and you're in CPI, you're welcome to be in CPI, and no one is allowed to make you feel unwelcome because you are trans. But if you're trans and you're in CPI and you're going to demand that CPI become a trans activist group, you're in the wrong organization. I mean, you are, right? I mean, we are not going to march for women's sports. We're not going to march for, bathrooms and all of that. And the same goes for people that are anti-trans. There's a number of those folks in CPI. We have people in our organization who feel that transgenderism is immoral, it goes against their religious faith, or they feel that the trans movement is an attack on women's rights. We have them in our organization as well. And the same thing goes for them. They're welcome to be in the group. And if anyone were to make them feel unwelcome in the group because they had that position, that would not be okay. However, if they want us to start opposing trans people and, having rallies against the trans agenda and all that, they're in the wrong organization. We're just not going to do that. And that's all I've ever said about this issue. That is all I've ever said about this issue. That has been my position since I started doing these live streams. This has been my position. However, if you listen to what the prevailing opinion, there are videos with hundreds of thousands of views that insist I'm just a bloodthirsty transphobe. I just get on here and rant about, I saw someone tweet out once, I get on here, Caleb rants about trans ideology for hours. No, I don't. I don't talk about that issue. I just don't talk about that issue. I'm not interested in it. All these books behind me are not about that. They are not about it. They are not about that. And I don't, other than saying that people need to be treated with human respect, live and let live, and I don't know enough about it, and I'm sorry, I feel sympathy for what these people go through. Other than that, I don't take a position, and I don't understand why that is so unforgivable. And the fact that that is not acceptable to certain people makes me feel like the people who say something negative might have some strong arguments on their side. I will say that the strongest argument in favor of people that are trans critical is the trans movement, because no matter what you say, I mean, it's weird. I just said on here, live and let live. And I just took a really strong stance against bullying, against, and that these people hear that and they think I murder trans people. They think, one of them tweeted at me, you're the kind of person who bullied trans person. And no, I'm not actually. I've always said, but it's like, they can't understand the difference between live and let live and you're a bloodthirsty, murderous bigot. And they want, you have to agree with them on everything. And if you don't agree with them on everything, you're no better than a Nazi. And when I see that, I think if people are that desperate to get the validation of society, to get everyone to agree with them, how confident are they in their position? Why do they need me to agree with them? Why am I sitting here on my bookshelf, thank you, Gala. Thank you. Why am I sitting here in front of my bookshelf? Why am I a threat to you? Right? And the fact that like there are people like seething with rage that I'm sitting here in front of my bookshelf saying what I'm saying, makes me wonder, like, if you're so threatened by people disagreeing with you, something's off. Something's off. And I will say the strongest argument in favor of people that are trans critical is the insanity of the trans activist community. I have never seen a group of people that is so triggered by anyone disagreeing with them. And that in and of itself reeks of unhealthy. I'm just being honest with you. I mean, if you are so threatened by me sitting here basically saying you can be who you want to be, it's your business, not mine, and that's not okay, and you're seething with rage right now, you have a problem, I think. It makes me think like maybe there's something off about this thing. And so that's where I'm at. And my position remains what it's always been. Live and let live, and have sympathy for what these people go through. Don't be mean to people. Let people be who they are. And other than that, I don't want to hear about the rest of it. That's my position. And yeah, I mean, look, I grew up in an area where there were a lot of fundamentalist Christians. a lot of fundamentalist Christians. And I have told this story many times, and I will tell it again. This happened. I will never forget this. One day, I was sitting in math class, and I said to this girl who sat next to me, who was a fundamentalist, she wore skirts down to her ankles every day. You know, she was a fundamentalist. I think her father was a pastor. And she sat next to me. And we were talking. I don't know how it came up in the conversation. And I said, you know what? I think when I turn 21 and when it's legal, I'm going to drink alcohol. And she said, Caleb, you should never drink alcohol. You know, it goes against the Bible. You should never drink alcohol. And I said, well, then why did Jesus turn water into wine as his first miracle? And then the girl sat next to me and she said, oh, I asked my dad about this. She explained, and she said, it wasn't actually wine. It was just grape juice. They just thought it was wine. It was actually just grape juice. And then I said to her, then how did they keep it from turning into wine? Because pasteurization had not been invented. There were no refrigerators back then. How did they keep this grape juice from turning into wine? I said that to her, just posing this question. She was insisting that Jesus' first miracle, turning water into wine, was actually grape juice. And I was saying, I don't understand how this is possible. She started crying. She started crying. And I'm sitting there, I'm like, oh shit. I'm like, oh shit. There you go, Caleb. You opened up your big mouth. You asked too many questions. And she started crying in my math class. And I'm just like, oh God, oh God, oh God. And then the next day of class, before we walk in, the teacher takes me out in the hall and he tells me, you shouldn't be insulting other people's religion. And I had to sit on the other side of the room. How dare you? And I think about that moment, how she just like started crying. And I realized that the reason she had been so triggered by me saying that was I'd made a pretty darn good point, right? If one believes, as she did, the Bible is 100% literally true, and if one believes that drinking alcohol is an unforgivable sin, one should never do it, it's a little bit of a contradiction, isn't it? I mean, it's a bit of a contradiction. And it wasn't actually wine, it was just grape juice, is not a very strong argument. You know, and what I was saying was a big threat to her worldview, and that's why she started crying, right? That's why I had smashed part of her worldview. Something had to be off, and she was frightened. She was genuinely frightened by what the implications of what I was saying to her. And so she started crying, right? Because what I was saying was a genuine threat to her. And I remember that moment a lot because when I see trans people on the internet, you know, who just start crying. And it just like they just can't get over the huge, explosive, emotional, no, I mean, they just get so triggered by anyone disagreeing with them. It makes me think that people disagreeing with them is somehow a threat to something. Something's off. Something's off. And that is a sign to me that leads me to think something may not be right there, but it's not for me to say, and it's not for me to say, right? And, I've stated my position, but again, when I see that reaction, when I see that insane reaction that you get from the internet trans community, if you disagree, I see these videos of these people who make videos about me, and it's like, Caleb platformed at turf. It's just like, I see these videos from people. I'm like, you're this mad at me because I interviewed somebody on my show who disagrees with you? Like, and I see these videos of these people just like seething with inner rage. Like, it's unforgivable that I take the position I take, or I talk to people who take a different position. I think something's off. Something's off. Another great example, right? And this, I'll probably get some of this tonight. Every single time on these live streams that I say anything negative about marijuana, which I'm in favor of full legalization of, or hallucinogens, again, which I'm in favor of full legalization of, I get a number of people who lose their shit in the chat. They just lose their shit. How dare you, Caleb? You're not a doctor. You don't know anything about it. Oh, weed is good, Caleb. Weed is good. Weed is good. Weed is good. And it's just like, okay, maybe I'm wrong. But I think getting fucked up on weed is probably not very good for your brain, right? It's probably not any worse or better than getting drunk. But I just don't see getting fucked up on weed as a good thing to do. Don't think anyone should ever go to jail for it. I'm in favor of full legalization. Don't think it's good for you. Hallucinogens, similar story. Not good to, trip on acid or mushrooms or whatever. Not good for your brain. No one should go to jail for it. Full legalization. But I'm not really thrilled with the experiments. But, people should be able, but I just say that, I just say, look, my opinion is drugs are bad, but I'm for legalization. And my chat will light up with people just going, oh my God, how dare you? You are right. And I see that and I'm thinking like, dude, you're like confessing to me you've got a drug problem, right? If weed is that important to you, that me getting on here and saying, I think it should be legal, but you probably shouldn't do it, it triggers you, you probably have a little bit of a problem. Here's a fun story. There was an ex-friend of mine. An ex-friend of mine, who, she drank a lot, but I didn't, it's not my business, right? People can drink. I mean, whatever. It's not my business. But she asked me why I didn't drink. And I told her why I don't drink, which is, I've told this story many times, is that when I drink, I either am sick the next day or I'm sick immediately, right? And that the last time I ever drank alcohol, I was at a movie theater with my wife, one of the movie theaters in Manhattan where they have an open bar. And I got a glass of white wine and the credits for the movie came up and I took my first sip of wine and my head started hurting. And throughout the whole movie, my head was throbbing in pain. And so I thought, I'm just not going to drink anymore. I'm not going to risk it. The movie was ruined by me taking a sip, right? And that it runs in my family. My mother's family the same way. My body and alcohol, they just don't get along, right? I'm very dry. I'm always drinking, as you've noticed. Drinking water, and I'm just a very dry person, and alcohol just dries me out. And for whatever reason, my anatomy, my body doesn't like alcohol. So I don't drink. And I told this to this ex-friend of mine. And she looked at me and she's like, whoa. She was just like, oh my God, right? And so the next time I saw her, she came to me and she had printed out all kinds of information about these pills I could order that would offset the effects so I could still drink. And, we stopped being friends. And I thought about that many times. And I realized after a while that she was an alcoholic. And I realized what she was doing. For her, drinking alcohol was like the most important thing in the world. It's like the most important thing in the world. And so she heard that I couldn't drink alcohol. And so she was trying to help me because alcohol was like the most important thing in the world, And I kind of feel sad for her because she was trying to help me, right? And she thought, wow, Caleb can't drink. And for me, drinking is like the most important thing ever. So you know, she was genuinely trying to help me. She couldn't imagine being me, someone who doesn't drink. I mean, that would be hell on earth for her. But I just think about, you know, that's a sad story. That's what addiction is. That's what alcoholism is. I mean, you know, and I saw that and I realized, like, you know, like when she heard that a friend of hers didn't drink, like, oh my God, that'd be like a friend of hers dying of cancer practically. I mean, it was like, you know, it was like, oh my God, you don't have alcohol in your life, Caleb. I'm going to rescue you. You need to have alcohol because it's the most important thing. It's really sad. It's really, really sad. You know, and when the chat lights up with people who just explode at me because I criticize marijuana or I criticize hallucinogens, I see the same thing because it's like I'm, you know, again, it's that same fragility that I saw in the girl who sat next to me, you know, who started crying when I asked her about, you know, I mean, it's that same kind of fragility. When people are that fragile about something, it's because they have more skin in the game, so to speak. It's because this is something that's very important to them. And I noticed that in myself too. There are times where there are things I get more defensive about, you know, and that's because they're more important to me, right? And that it's important to keep track of these things, right? Not all of our thoughts are necessarily conscious. Sometimes our emotions, our feelings reflect deeper thoughts that are not within our mind. I mean, we talk about the subconscious, but anyway, that's a whole long thing. We got plenty of super chats to get to. Plenty more super chats to get to, so we'll go to it. All right. John McCarthy says the Marx letter is posted on the CPI website. Very good. Thank you, John. All right. Mariah said, love the history lessons on these streams. Well, glad you like them. Very, very good. Ooh, here's a good one. Thoughts on Macron's trip to Beijing? Yes. Yes. Thoughts on Macron's trip to Beijing? I certainly have thoughts about Macron's trip to Beijing. The divide between the European mainland and Britain and America is coming. Bush, you remember freedom fries? Remember how Germany and France and like all the NATO countries were opposed to the U.S. invasion of Iraq? Britain went along with it. The European mainland has gone along with this war in Ukraine, and they've gotten screwed economically for doing so. And now France is up in arms about it. And China is heavily invested, and China is friendly to Russia. There is a division coming. I am convinced that give it time, and the divisions within the European ruling class and the suffering of the European masses that is giving birth to all these protests is gonna have to absolutely have to manifest itself. Europe is gonna have to stop going along with America. But there you go. Lori, yes, absolutely it should be legal. I've said many times I'm for full legalization of all drugs, right? No one should go to jail for, you know, utilizing substances recreationally, right? I mean, I marijuana, all of it, you know, I'm for full legalization. And I've made that clear many times. That is my position, right? And you know, just because I don't think someone should do something doesn't mean I think that someone should go to jail for it, right? It's not my job to regulate your personal life. All right. So there you go. But there was another super chat that went by. Piha says weed was made illegal because the lumber industry was threatened by hemp's usefulness. That's true. Yeah. But you shouldn't smoke a lot every day. That can lead to gaps in memory. Yeah. No, that is absolutely true, right? Is that, you know, the lumber industry, I mean, that is absolutely true. And they used racism. They said, oh, people will smoke weed. It'll make white women sleep with black men. And, you know, yeah, it was awful. I mean, you know, and the Reefer Madness is one of the dumbest films in the world. Look, I am not a drug war guy. I am for full legalization. No one should ever be jailed for using drugs. And I mean, it may be better for you than alcohol, but that doesn't mean that I'm in favor of people doing it. I'm not. I just generally, if you're getting fucked up, it's not a good thing. That's generally my attitude, right? And you know, I have never smoked marijuana. You know, I have used alcohol. I have been drunk before in my life. But I don't think it's a good thing. It's not, you know, it being, what is the term? Inebriated being inebriated is not a good state of being. That's my opinion. But you are free to live your life as you wish, and the state should not interfere. That is my position. All right. Are there any popular organizations that push a narrative of the Civil War? Are they controlled opposition? Well, honestly, the Communist Party USA, they have international publishers. And international publishers prints a lot of really good books on the U.S. Civil War. I'll be honest with you. International publishers, they print W.E.B. Du Bois writings. They print Herbert Apotheker's writings. And for years, the Communist Party USA, their publishing house, International Publishers, published a lot of really good books on the Civil War. They printed the speeches of Frederick Douglass, the speeches of John Brown. They printed a biography of John Brown written by W.E.B. Du Bois. It's an amazing book. I used to have a copy of it here. I think I may have given it to somebody or something, but there's a book, called John Brown by W.E.B. Du Bois. And the Communist Party on paper has the right line on the U.S. Civil War. Unfortunately, because they're a bunch of Democrats and they pander to Democrats, at this point, they're, embracing the 1619 Project, and they're embracing, who's that guy there's one of their members is a professor who wrote The Counter-Revolution of 1776. And they just go along with whatever the Democrats do. But they historically, and in the books they still print by international publishers, have a very good position on the U.S. Civil War. They do. I mean, and that anything that was printed by international publishers on the history of the Civil War is generally pretty good. I'm trying to see what I've got up there, but yeah, there you go. There you go. All right. And then Mariah asked me, during Occupy Wall Street, the New York Times printed racism and sexism 400% more. Doesn't surprise me. The Obama administration, that was the beginning of a dramatic shift. It was, starting with social media, suddenly the New York Times wing of the ruling class, the Eastern establishment, they had the upper hand. And I remember the Gina 6, and that was like the first social media generated protest, it seemed, and things were changing, right? And the Eastern establishment, the ultra rich with their more liberal managerial agenda, they had the upper hand, no doubt about it. And yeah, they want to fight a culture war, and they don't want to fight a class war. They think the people are the enemy, deep down. They are postmodernists. They are anti-populists. And I got into that in my interview with Kim Iverson. So I'll be posting that soon. All right, everybody. I'm going to put on the closing music. We'll be back soon. Maybe tomorrow night. We shall see. We'll be back. Yeah, we'll be back soon. So there we go. Upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. Good point, John. Good point. Good point.